So I wanted to thank Laura for setting things up, and Kim, and also Glenn Marshall, my longtime friend at AMA, for putting this all together and connecting us up and making this happen. Now, to put this whole thing in perspective, I'm going to talk about what we've learned from the COVID-19 crisis in terms of the supply chain. And one way of looking at it is that the problems that we've had with that supply chain and with much of the US supply chain is due to a failure to apply lean principles. If companies had been consistently applying good lean principles, the problems would have been much less. So I'm going to show you how applying lean principles, amongst other processes, can help in the future to avoid similar problems. A little background on me, probably more interesting than everything that was read. I grew up in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and the biggest thing in Elizabeth was Singer sewing machine. And this factory in about 1910 was the largest factory in the world. It had 2.6 million square feet, 5,000 workers. This was a juggernaut of industry in its day, and supplied sewing machines for the world, the US, the world. And I drove past 20 years ago and everything's gone. There's no Singer products made, as far as I can tell, anywhere in the United States. Everything had been lost to offshore. And in my career selling machine tools and other kinds of equipment, I saw industry after industry, company after company disappear and be replaced by foreign products. And so I cried then for what we had lost. And I said, we're going to have to fix that. And I'm going to tell you what I'm doing to fix it. And I hope you'll share in that mission, that effort. The loss of manufacturing in the US, you can see it a little bit in the statistics. You can see how manufacturing output is plateauing, the last 20 years. I think the reality is worse than that. If you looked at pounds or cubic yards of stuff, I think we're down. We don't make as much steel, anything else as generally as we used to. And as a result, manufacturing share of GDP has been cut in half from what it used to be. But it isn't because we don't consume goods. In fact, our rate of growth of consumption of goods, of things, has been about 2.5% per year for the last 12 years. And that's faster than the rate of growth of the GDP. So we're consuming historical rates of goods. So we're not just consuming services. The problem is we're just not making most of the goods or many of the goods. So this shows the trade deficit of the US, which has gone from a dramatic surplus after World War II, when all the other countries were bombed out, to increasing trade deficits. This is shown as a percentage of GDP, but what it amounts to is the last several years, about 800 billion, that's with a B, $800 billion of goods trade deficit. That's the amount that our imports exceed our exports. And that trade deficit says, we're not self-sufficient, we're not making enough of what we produce. As a result of it, manufacturing jobs as a percentage of US employment has been cut in half, more than in half, down to about 8-9% of total employment. And if you put those two charts together, here's the employment, here's the trade deficit, you see it very tightly correlated. So it turns out that 2/3 or 3/4 of the loss of manufacturing jobs over the last 20 or 30 years is due to the trade deficit, not to automation, but due to the trade deficit. So why did all that offshoring occur? I've broken into 3 categories here from a macro perspective, from a big picture perspective. The US dollar has gone up about 300% against our trading partners in the last 40 years. As a result, wages, taxes, everything tends to cost more here than it should, which makes us not competitive. And the reason people go offshore for product is because the product's cheaper offshore. China joining the World Trade Organization had a major impact. They've about 2.5 million of the 5 million lost manufacturing jobs were lost to China. And so when China joined the WTO, they were given special privileges to ship to the United States. People talk about it as opening China to the world, and I think of it more like opening the world to China. And China was the predator, and it took huge amounts of work, manufacturing, GDP away from many of the countries, but especially the United States. The consumers played an important role in this. They, in the US especially, demand the lowest priced product. That's not good. And then separately, too many of them chose not to go into apprenticeships, but instead to go to university. And when they went to university, they typically studied liberal arts instead of engineering. So we don't have the skilled workforce that, say, a Germany or a Switzerland has. The companies play a role. Very short-term focus, how to make this quarter's earnings or this month's earnings. And as a result, significant underinvestment in capital equipment. Our average machine tool is much older than the case in Germany. And we have about a third as many robots per 1,000 manufacturing workers as does Korea. We invest a third as much in CNC machine tools as does China. And if you don't put in the new equipment, you're not going to be competitive, especially if your wage rates are high and you don't have the skills that, say, a Germany or a Switzerland has. I'm going to talk a lot about total cost or total cost of ownership. This is a core principle of, I'd say, quality and lean, and US companies have significantly underutilized this tool, and just utilizing it significantly, as I'll show you, can play an important role in bringing the work back. And I believe that's part of your role as lean practitioners. Fortunately, balance is starting to be achieved. We talk about reshoring or onshoring, both mean more or less the same thing. Once again, making in the US product that will be sold or assembled here. FDI, foreign direct investment, it's the same logic. So GM makes something here, again, that's reshoring. Toyota makes something here, that's FDI, but they both follow the same logic that their company will be more profitable producing in the US for the US market instead of producing somewhere else and shipping to the US. We talk about localization, producing near the consumer. Nearshoring is a very popular term also. So if work comes back from Asia or India or Turkey or somewhere, and it comes to Mexico or Canada, more likely Mexico because of the wage rates, that's nearshoring. And my preference is it comes to the US, but when you take a bigger picture view of it, the work that comes out of China or product that comes out of China has about 5% US content, and product that comes out of Mexico has about a 40% US content. So if the product is so labor intensive that it cannot be made competitively in the US, I'd rather get it to Mexico and pick up that 40% rather than just the 5% we had over in China. In addition, the Chinese themselves are helping restore balance. This chart shows unit labor costs for a variety of countries and how they've changed over the last 20 years. And the red line is the US, the blue line is China. And this, each year, whatever the starting value was expressed in US dollars, the value is adjusted for the change in wage rate in the country, for the change in productivity and the change in currency relative to the dollar. So we have an index unit labor cost in dollars. And you can see China is up to about 500. So where China labor costs were so low 20 years ago that you almost didn't have to count them, now they're still low compared to the US, but they're high enough that Chinese product in some cases is now no longer competitive. So the challenge to the US is to make sure as the work comes out of China that some of it comes here, some comes to Mexico, perhaps some to Canada, rather than all of it going to Vietnam, Cambodia, India, or somewhere else. So some other reasons that have helped. Amazon's helped. They and others have gotten this idea across of e-commerce, and when you and I order, we expect it today or tomorrow. And if there's a surge in demand on the distribution center and the supplier is in China and it has to be surface shipped and it's going to take 5-6 weeks to get there, that's not going to work. So that gives a significant advantage to the local supplier that can get new product in a couple of days or a week. Automation obviously helps because US has higher labor rates if there's fewer hours per unit of output, then we're more competitive. Trump's tariffs, that's not our choice of how to solve the problem, but there's no question that they have made Chinese specifically products less competitive. Minimum order quantities, typically the foreign, especially the Chinese supplier, wants to ship a container load of the product. That drives up inventory, creates other problems. People in the US increasingly want a made in USA product. Deming, I'll tell you things he's done that were very helpful if you will apply them. And lean in general, the things that AME proposes and trains, the proper application of those things will help to continue the trend. I think a very interesting and important announcement came out last year from the Business Roundtable. This is a group of 181 major companies. You recognize many of the faces here. And they signed a statement that said that in addition to a corporation's traditional purpose of profiting for the shareholder, and that's what it's been for 100 years, in addition to that, that companies have an obligation to other stakeholders, including the employees, the community, and the supplier. And if you say, who has been hurt most by offshoring? Well, communities, employees, and supplier. And who will be helped most by reshoring? Those same groups. And as I'll show you, we can do that in many of the cases, in the case of many products, without hurting the shareholder. So those of you who sell to other companies or want to convince within your company, bring this point up and see if that will convince management to consider reshoring. The good news is the trend has been pretty positive. Back when we started in 2010, about 6,000 jobs were announced coming back to the US in that year, the annual rate. And it's gotten up to 2017 was 180,000. So 30 times as high a rate of jobs going back. And it's due to these positive trends that I showed you, but it's still not enough. Despite all this, as you saw in that other chart, the trade deficit has stayed about constant. And we need to bring the jobs back at 2 or 3 times the rate that they've been doing so that within 20 years we can eliminate that trade deficit and make the US more self-sufficient so we don't have crises like the one we're having with COVID. So just to show a little more about the societal benefit of this, eliminating the trade deficit would increase US manufacturing by 40%. That's about 5 million jobs. Probably the same thing would happen with Canada. It would cut the budget deficit. There's this budget deficit that's growing hugely right now. Provide materiel for defense, awfully important. Increasingly, the Defense Department cannot find in the US the products it needs to produce the military weapons and so on that are necessary. The middle class, we hear all about income inequalities, and small to medium-sized manufacturers that have disappeared would largely be restored. Make it a lot easier to recruit the skilled workforce. Most of you have problems getting the skilled workforce you need. Partially that's because the smart student has said, why would I go into manufacturing? It's all going to China. Well, reverse that image. Retail looks to me like it's going to be significantly cut. I think there's a great opportunity to take ex-retail workers, train them in manufacturing, and take some of the strip malls and turn them into shops and produce here things that we now have been importing from offshore. Pollution is reduced when you produce here. I've done an analysis of a 2-pound aluminum die casting, and producing it in the US for the US instead of in China and shipping here cuts the carbon footprint by 1/3 to 1/2. It's possible, it's very realistic to have increases in productivity and more manufacturing employment rather than the hype that's associated with tax the robots because they're going to take all our jobs. No, we need the robots so we'll be competitive so we can increase manufacturing employment. So to come back to COVID-19, we were coming along, the economy is doing okay, reshoring is doing pretty well, but we were still feeding on cheap imports. And then we had the tariffs in 2019, Trump's tariffs. And everybody started to get, at least understand what a trade deficit was. Politicians were starting to say maybe something needs to be done. Chinese imports came down a bit. but not too much happened. And then COVID-19 came along. And night after night, we saw all these shortages of all these products that we essentially don't make here. And all of a sudden, people are worried about their jobs, their life, significantly because of the supply chain issues. And so you've seen on TV repeatedly the gowns and the masks and the gloves that were essentially impossible to find. And we read about penicillin and active ingredients for other pharmaceuticals, 80, 90% dependent on offshore. So everybody says that that's totally impossible. So it's clear something will be done for these healthcare products. There's like 8, 10 pieces of legislation in Washington to change that and make sure it happens. But there's other key dependency. I'm sure if you look inside your companies, there's products, components, materials you cannot get here. There's rare earth minerals. There's most of the 5G electronic systems, communication systems that we hear about so much in the news. A lot of the discrete components, the diodes, transistors, and so on, typically not made here. I mentioned the material for the Defense Department, apparel and footwear. 97% of what we consume comes from offshore. If we lost the ability to bring those products in, we'd be going around in rags and pretty soon, because a lot of what we put on isn't going to wear out, isn't going to wear very well. Machine tools, that's the industry I come out of. And the significant majority of what we consume comes from offshore, whereas 50 years ago, 70 years ago, we were the major maker of machine tools. And companies have supply chains to get all these things, and the supply chains stretch all over the world. And periodically they're interrupted or devastated by coronavirus, by the Fukushima tsunami, by the floods in Thailand, by the LA dock workers refusing to unload the container ships, by the volcano in Iceland that stopped air freight coming in from Europe for weeks at a time. And so all these things have been proven to be very risky. I was on a webinar with a very well-known professor, David Simchi-Levy of MIT, and he said, if you have supply chains like this stretched all over the world, you should expect at least one of those supply chains to be significantly broken by a crisis of some kind every year. And so our solution is not to stretch most of your supply chains all over the world, especially for critical components, but instead to have them as close as possible to the assembly plant, ideally, in the same town, ideally like Toyota would do with all the suppliers nestled right around the Toyota assembly plant, but acceptably somewhere in the country or also in Mexico and Canada, very close allies, people we can count on, where we are unlikely to be separated by one of those crises. So another reason we got here was that companies do not use TCO, total cost. Specifically, about 60% of them look only at simple models like wage, where is the wage cheapest, or purchase price variance, where can I buy the product cheapest, or a little bit better landed cost, which might be freight and duty. But on any of these methods, they're ignoring something like 20% of the total cost. And when you ignore 20% of the value of something, you're often going to make a mistake. And we'll show you how big that is. So we provide online on our website the total cost of ownership estimator, which is a free resource for you, which I hope some of you are using. I hope those who are not will pick it up and use it. It's intended for buyers to buy smarter and sellers to sell smarter. I'll tell you more about that. But in this example, the Chinese ex-works price was 70, the US was 100. So the procurement person looks at that and says, that's 30% difference, $30 a unit. I'm going to buy 12,000 a year. That's $360,000 worth of purchase price variance. Of course, I'll have it done in China. That's a third of my objective for the year. But then when they look at total cost, they say it's 98 for China, 108 for the US, 10% difference. And projecting forward, assuming the current rates of wage increase and currency change, the Chinese total cost would be higher in a couple of years. So hopefully at that point, the procurement person would say, well, there's no sense sending the work away because I'm going to have to bring it back and it's heavily tooled. Why don't I keep that here, and why don't I start planning to bring back the similar products that are already offshore? So when you take, so we've had hundreds of companies that have used the TCO estimator. We protect their data, but we analyze it. And this is on hundreds of cases of China versus the US. This is a ratio of the Chinese price to the US price expressed down here. And so you can see the mode or the peak is around 70%. And then there's just a little bit of the area under the curve that's above 100. And above 100 is the interesting area, because that's the area where the US price is less than the Chinese price. But when we shift over to total cost, the peak shifts up here to about 85%, a lot more area. And if there happens to be a Trump 15% tariff on it, then the peak shifts to just about 100%. And now a significant portion of the area is to the right of the curve. So if we take that data and slice it a bit differently, we can see that for the price curve, about 8% of the time, the product would be produced in the US. For the TCO curve, about 32%, and TCO, if there's a 15% Trump tariff on a product coming out of China, about 46%. So all of a sudden, going from price up to total cost or total cost with tariff, entirely different perspective on what's possible to bring back on the economic feasibility of fixing those supply chains by producing in the US instead of bringing in from some low labor cost country somewhere halfway around the world. Now, total cost, what's in that? Everybody has a different list, but I've tried to include all the factors that I could find that other experts have identified. So this isn't all of them, but freight, certainly, duties, standard duties, travel costs to go check on the supplier, packaging. There's more packaging on something that's going to take 4 weeks by ocean than something you're going to deliver down the street. Inventory carrying costs, 20, 25%, something like that. The ability to do just in time, which makes this more attractive. And then those are the hard costs, but then there's risks and strategic factors. So for example, emergency air freight, the product that you have to bring in because you ran out or because the last shipment that came by container was bad or you changed the design. The ability of engineering and manufacturing to get together and optimize the product and the process, speaking in one language physically together, looking at the product and process together while they're doing that. The increased interest in Made in USA, the risk of stocking out. When you stock out, you may be able to air freight, but if you can't get, then that costs you money. If you cannot get product here, then maybe you lose a customer, or maybe you lose the long-term value of that customer. Intellectual property risk is greater if your product is made over there with the tooling, et cetera, than if it's made here in the country where there's more respect for intellectual property law. The quality is, Chinese quality, no question, has gotten better, but US quality on average is still better than that. So various groups have tried to quantify the hidden cost to put more credibility on it. So I've listed 6 or 7 groups here, and consensus would be that it's somewhere in the 15 to 25% range, 15 to 25% of ex-works price, depending on the other country, depending on the distance, depending on the complexity of the product, the quality, the freight cost, is it big, is it small, et cetera, et cetera. But 15 to 25%, so very real numbers. In the studies you do on lean, if you ignored 15 to 25% of the data, would you be doing the job right? No. So I mentioned Deming before, very clear message to stop buying on the basis of price, instead minimize total cost. So the quality movement, I'd say, is clear. John Shook at the Lean Enterprise Institute talks about total costs and all the problems associated with offshoring, and and you're having those problems because people didn't look at total cost. And then Jim Womack here, who's my neighbor in Maine, and he's on my deck here, and and he says the same thing. You've got to calculate the true cost you need. And when he lists costs to consider, all of them are in the TCO estimator. So if you believe in the things that Deming and Shook and Womack have presented, then I think you should all be using total cost. Many of you use TPS, Toyota Production System, and it's an excellent system. And as you know, in the left-hand column, the Toyota waste, the MUDA, and the intent is to minimize those wastes, to only work on things that bring value to the customer. And I've listed in the right-hand column how offshoring contributes to each of those wastes. So it makes waste worse. So it's clear if you want to minimize waste, you do it by reshoring. If you want to minimize cost, well, that might be with offshoring. But the question is, can you, by reshoring, eliminate enough waste to make up for the difference in cost or price? And that's the challenge, and that's what the TCO estimator is for. So another way of looking at this, sometimes you have to justify your lean efforts. It takes time, commitment of people, might take equipment. And Womack talks about lean shoring. He says, when you bring the work back, don't bring it back the way you made it 15 years ago. Bring it back with proper lean principles, with a good organization of the factory, with newer equipment, with better training. That's lean shoring from Jim's perspective. And if you only look at the price, say $8 in China, $10 here, you say, well, I can't get 20% out, so I shouldn't even try. But if you look at total cost and see there's only a couple of percent difference, now you say, if I bring it back smart here with lean, with automation, with training, can I get 10% out and have the total cost be lower here? The answer is often, like I showed before, 20, 30% of the time, 40% of the times, yes. So I came up with my contribution to the lean culture, and I call it walking the whole Gemba. And so my idea is that the US lean people walk around their factory and they walk the Gemba and they figure out what should be done. And you might have a sister company or a supplier over in China or India or somewhere, and they may have a lean expert walking around their factory, walking the Gemba and trying to figure out what can be done. How often do you think that lean expert in China is thinking about whether it makes sense to produce the product in China and ship it to the US instead of doing it in the US? They're probably the last thing on their mind. And so if nobody is thinking about whether it makes sense to have the two factories separated like that, then nobody is walking the whole Gemba. So I encourage you to think about that if that fits your situation. A significant problem with companies is siloing. And so salesmen come into procurement and say, how about buying these things from me? Procurement says, no, your price is too high. Salesman says, I know you're having problems with warranty and you've got too much inventory and you're stocking out and you're having to send people all the time over to the supplier in China or India somewhere. Procurement says, not my problem, not in my budget, that's somebody else's budget. So you have to go around them and get to other people in the company. So the purpose of using TCO is to, as I said, for the bigger companies, those procurement people to buy smarter, to think about all the relevant costs and risks, and for the suppliers to sell smarter. And your company, you may have both roles where this could help. So when you're implementing this, if I would suggest you don't go to the president and say, we have to reshore everything. So the purpose isn't to reshore, it's to reevaluate. It's say, look, we see all these problems in supply chains, in our supply chain, in other people's. Let's reevaluate. Let's see if there's some work some product we'll bring in that would make sense to reshore. So the initial objective is to reevaluate, even though the end objective is to reshore what makes sense. We would suggest looking at the most suitable products and families, gathering data, finding some allies within the organization, running the total cost calculation, find some clear winners. And once you've found the winners, now it's easier to engage more support from the rest of the organization and look at using lean, training, automation to make even more work economically feasible to bring back. So one of the things that I suggest starting with is to look at products that are causing pain. So look at products where the company is having delivery issues, lost orders, emergency air freight, quality, warranty issues, inventory is huge, where travel, people are having to travel all the time to the supplier. Where people are complaining about late night telephone calls. There's IP loss or risk, where there's significant regulatory issues, where Trump's tariffs have been imposed because that's just raised costs by 15 to 25%. So look where those pain issues are, because if there's pain, then the people that are feeling the pain are likely to work with you and say, yeah, total cost. Oh, your total cost allows for it, will understand my pain, will quantify my pain, and will help us eliminate the pain. Well, now you've got an ally in using total cost and in lean. So we'd say in that sense, build alignment. So work with the natural allies. So if you're not lean, you bring the lean people in because they should understand what I've just described. There's some kind of a green champion in your company or your customer's company, and they'll understand what I described about the waste or the pollution being higher if you're bringing the product in from China. Regulatory people that are worried, like during the coronavirus, the FDA stopped testing the pharmaceutical production facilities in China because they couldn't go there. They weren't afraid to go there, whatever, weren't allowed there. Well, there's no regulatory compliance then. The quality people, the warranty people, we've heard cases of line management that has been given the right to control where the suppliers will be because the line management was concerned about the quality and the intellectual property and the inventory and the travel expense and the opportunity cost, whereas the procurement people were ignoring all those costs. So talk to the C-suite about the stakeholders like I described with the business roundtable. We know our job is to bring value to the customer, and if we think about the customer, how much benefit, how much value do they put on made in China, and the number of weeks that a product spent in a container, and in contrast, how much value do they put on quality, on delivery, on made in USA, on sustainability, on the things that reshoring actually does deliver to them. So I'd say made in China, the only thing it brings is price, ex works price. But if TCO shows that we can get a comparable price by doing it here and user price, then that's a good idea. So we'd say, why put up with all the complexity involved in the offshoring, all the waste, when you can bring it back? And so, as I say in the last point there, the challenge is to use the TCO and find which parts the savings on overhead, the savings on inventory, the savings on all those miscellaneous risks will be greater than the almost inevitably higher manufacturing costs associated with the higher U.S. wage rates. So here we track the reasons the companies chose to reshore, and I've listed the highest ratings of why companies, things that went wrong offshore, and I made in red the ones that sound sort of like wastes. They're sort of like the things I've been talking about: inventory, loss of control, travel, quality. Well, those sounds like waste. I don't see any value in those for the customer. So the companies are reporting the things that sound like lean wastes, but when we look back over here now, what went right in the United States, only in a few cases did they actually mention using lean. So my conclusion is that the company management, using common sense, is seeing that it makes sense to eliminate those wastes and bring the work back, but they're not specifically ascribing it to their lean process. So my conclusion is that there's a lot of opportunity for you as lean practitioners to actively make this happen, that would force lean, described as the factor that drove it, higher up on this list. And more reshoring will come back because people will see what you can show them. So here's my favorite case of reshoring. This company, Mori, makes printed circuit boards, things like I show here. A good sized company, $100 million a year. And two pieces of information. One, they told me about a housing, an aluminum die-cast housing that they had been purchasing from China. They had a quality issue. Customer got really worked up. They reshored and found a domestic source, a local source in Illinois, cut the inventory of the part by 94%. Now, I'm not promising you 94% as being normal, but I think 50%, 50% is a very reasonable amount. Later, a couple of years later, they came to me and they said, Harry, we're about to lose our best US customer. A Chinese competitor has given them a lower ex-works price. And so the VP sales and I did the TCO calculation. Tony took it into the customer and he credits that with saving or winning a $60 million order. So like I said, this is both for buying smarter and for selling smarter. So we specifically on the selling smarter side, we provide a service to companies, perhaps yours. Companies could be contract manufacturers, or they could be selling motors or pumps to somebody higher up the supply chain. And if you can identify the products that you're really good at making, we can identify the biggest importers of those products, who the company is, where they are, what they're bringing in, how many tons per year, some idea what they're paying for it, whom they're buying it from offshore. And we can train your company to sell using total cost to go in and convince those importers to buy from you instead of continuing to import from wherever offshore. This is a way you can this is a way to help in sales at your company to increase the volume, which is pretty good, right? Should be helpful right now. We have a National Metalworking Reshoring Award that will be awarded at IMTS 2020 in McCormick Place. And it's still, we have a couple of days left to submit. And if you don't make it by then, we'll have another one next year. So if you don't submit this year, I hope you'll submit next year. We also have a similar one for the sewn products industry. I'm looking for cooperation with you. I'd love to hear about your incorporating total cost in your lean efforts. I'd love to have you test made in USA, the impact on quality, inventory availability, how your company helps companies find made in USA products, because that's a big problem for consumers. Document your reshoring cases, any of those things that happen. I'd love to hear about it, love to write articles about it, make you and your company famous for doing it, help you do it. I've had a couple of people ask me about providing a certificate in total cost. So if any of you think that would be a nice thing to be able to get, then send me an email or mention it on the chat line, and then we'll explore that. So we're going to have a deeper dive in total cost at the AME Annual 2020. Again, I thank Kim and Glenn and the group for organizing that. And I'm proud to say that the Reshoring Initiative, my group, is partnering with AME to drive reshoring and total cost. So we're a nonprofit we've got 23 sponsors. You can see them here, trade associations, companies, all kinds of groups that support our work and make it possible for us to drive this reshoring trend in the country and in North America. And this is how we have always thought of ourselves, as the little Dutch boy holding back the flood of offshoring and with a finger in the dike and waiting for the village elders to come in and find him and fix the dike. And so you're the village elders, and if you'll pick up the challenge and apply your lean principles, then there'll be less offshoring, there'll be more reshoring. This will be a safer, more stable economy and society for us and our children. So that's the message. And you've got my contact information there. Anybody that wants help, anybody that has some cases to offer, anybody thinks I'm crazy and wants to tell me so, love to hear from you, and look forward to working with you.